Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 News. Mercedes have unveiled the W15, Lewis Hamilton's final ever Mercedes car and his final chance to win the 8th world title with the Silver Arrows, but the car features many fascinating innovations, certainly around the front wing. Many other teams will be looking at this today and saying either we need to generate our version of that ASAP or saying to the FIA this is illegal and needs to be banned. What will the outcome be? Very much intrigued your perspective in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. First of all, this is the RB20, some higher quality video we got yesterday from the shakedown they did at Silverstone, and the more you look at the RB20, the more you see differences really between it and the previous RB19, and honestly there are some serious questions that while other teams might be copying the Red Bull idea, they have now gone an entirely new direction and are once again forging the path ahead. Because the closer you look at this image, firstly you see the Mercedes cannons, the Mercedes bazookas, whatever you want to say, on the back of the car here that were inspired, it seems, by last year's W14. The W15 hasn't really featured these again, which I did mention yesterday. It would be interesting to see if Newey thinks that what Mercedes did there was actually pretty good, whereas Mercedes might think, well, the car didn't work, so we've got to start again from the ground up, whereas Red Bull actually might think, you know what, Mercedes car did have some good ideas, but it was just flawed fundamentally, but we're going to take those ideas towards the rear of the car. But also, what's going on here at the side pod inlet? This is what people are trying to figure out here, because other teams have generally copied the Red Bull style, like longer bottom lip that they introduced in Hungary last year. Now we are seeing a Red Bull side pod inlet. Now there is an inlet here somewhere. We can't really see it because it's dark, but you know, the air goes somewhere. But we can see the extended upper lip and then what seems to be representative, honestly, of what Mercedes used to have. I mean, have a look at this on some of the Mercedes side pods. Looks kind of similar to what's going on there. So will be fascinating to see what Red Bull have done here. And of course, it is worthy of note that this is just the launch spec. What happens in Bahrain, we'll see. And what happens tomorrow at their launch, we will see. But yeah, the more I look at the Red Bull, the more that I see some major differences, which of course are expected elsewhere on the grid as well. And we have definitely seen with Mercedes. Ferrari, however, have had a surprisingly conventional launch. There's been lots of talk that their car is maybe not as aggressive as people expected. And maybe when it comes to Bahrain, it'll be a different story. But of course, they've not changed their rear suspension fundamental concept. There's been lots of talk about that. But have they understood that what Red Bull have done on the rear suspension is not absolutely necessary? Because Ferrari did have some strengths last year, and they did, finally really for Ferrari, make some progress throughout the year, which they very rarely do. So they clearly believe their direction is good, but I guess we'll see this season when it hits the track whether the Ferrari is actually good enough. But Charles does say that last year, after the first lap or 3-4 laps in the car last year, you remember they did the shakedown, right? They launched the SF23, they drove it around the track, and Charles said he wasn't happy with the behaviour of the car. The car was very, very difficult to drive. This year, the car feels healthier and in a better place. It's always funny, right, that if you ask the drivers in February, if you ask them now, how's the car? Like, Charles, how's the car, Lewis? Is it any good? They'll say, well, it's too early to say. We'll have to see what happens when we get on track. But when you ask them at the end of the year, they say, yeah, I knew from day one that it was trash, or I knew from day one that it was good. So today, when Hamilton, I'm pretty sure, is going to be in the W15 at the Silverstone test, he will know, to some great extent, whether this car's any good or not. And Charles Leclerc said that last year, he already knew that that car wasn't really going to cut it, and he says that this year the actual feeling was much better. And it's quite rare the drivers actually will address this, right? They usually won't say anything to this effect when they've tested the car for the first time. So clearly Leclerc is confident in this machine, but will it be as good as arguably it looks? That's the question. This is what the McLaren looks like. It's the same as we saw the other day. They already revealed the livery, and to be fair, their car launch wasn't really much because they didn't really reveal anything new. The only thing I'll say about this that I found interesting really was that the side, this is of course a render, right? It's not the real car sitting here in the factory. It seems they've deliberately obscured the kind of floor elements of the car because apparently they've done a fair bit of work on that. So this is what Autosport say, that they did some trickery in their launch images to hide what they've done around the floor edge. So kind of fascinating that McLaren seem to believe they've either found something around the floor or there's some serious innovation happening there. I will say though on McLaren that Andrea Stella said, I will say somewhat surprisingly, that there are a number of innovations on the car, but not all of the areas we want to address have been completed for our launch spec car. Those areas are now the focus of the in-season development. So this is the issue for McLaren and for other teams, that Red Bull set a standard so high that catching up is such a challenge that doing so over one winter is, even for a team like McLaren, it seems kind of implausible to expect. So they're hoping they've made big steps for the start of the season, but they don't believe that they can get where they believe they can get for some time, which means that if Red Bull are there already, then arguably Max Verstappen is going to have quite the head start. Let's say McLaren big a big upgrade, 5-6 races into the season, Spain or whatever, right? Whenever it potentially could be, and that puts them right on par with Red Bull. Max might already have a substantial point lead at that point. So that's, I guess, the concern there for McLaren. But really their goal is obviously to try and compete for the championship, but just win a race would be nice. Because maybe Red Bull will still dominate the season, but I definitely expect behind Red Bull it to be fascinatingly competitive, especially with this machine. This is the Mercedes W15 Performance, whatever they call it. And it's honestly a beautiful looking livery. I've always liked the Mercedes liveries, to be fair. They're bringing back the silver. Of course, they've got the Petronas blue, whatever they call it. Total Wolf says their intention always was to bring back the silver when the weight allowed it, and that's exactly what they've done. The front wing is actually really interesting, and we'll get into that in a second. So are the side pod inlets. I mean, this is a render, first of all. It actually doesn't look the same, this render, as the car looks when we see it in person. We'll discuss in a second. But yeah, this is the W15 compared to the W14. Dramatically different. People were asking, was it going to be silver? Was it going to be black? It's both. It's both silver and black, and I think it looks pretty damn good. Sure, a lot of it is carbon, as you might expect, but I think Mercedes were going to do that anyway. I like the gradient as well in the colouring here. I think there's been some teams that could benefit from doing this, where they choose a colour and then they have a gradient of it. We can see the silver changes as we go down the nose, and I think the livery looks pretty spectacular. Personally, is it going to be fast? That's really what I care about. I'm not really a liveries man. You guys might have been able to work this out as we do these car launches. I'm more interested, is it quick, is it not quick? I don't really care what it looks like, as long as it has some sort of identity. I want the cars to look different and to be easily recognisable, but, the colours they choose and everything doesn't really bother me once I've seen it on track for a few times and I know what car that is, as long as it's distinct. But there are a few fascinating innovations here that we'll dive into. This is let's say increase the brightness, increase the contrast. Have a look at this side pod inlet and just the shape of the side pod in general. This is by far the biggest undercut that we have seen Mercedes try and pull off here. I mean, it's a complete opposite to the zero pod they started with, right? It looks like a zero pod now, but it's of course entirely horizontal rather than vertical as they did for the first couple of years. And as we can see, it's got this very fascinating shaped side pod inlet here, a really deep undercut below the side pod itself. And yeah, this is a kind of better zoomed in version of this. You guys can see the carbon and where that air is meant to flow underneath the side pod and how it's flowing into the side pod, because as we can see on other cars, they've gone for maybe a similarly approached side pod inlet here, which has been somewhat Red Bull inspired, with the slightly longer lower lip and then the shorter upper lip. But apparently Red Bull might have gone an entirely different approach and taken an entirely different route on this one. But as I say, this is a render. The car that turns up in Bahrain will look different, and even the car they had in front of them at the Brackley facility looked different again. The two things they focused mainly on, because last year's car had some strengths, not that many. I will also say here from the rear view of the car, you can see that there isn't as much of a kind of, bazooka, cannon, whatever people call it, at the rear of the car. It's still there to some degree, but it's not quite as extreme as it was last year, and maybe not quite as extreme as Red Bull have designed for this year as well. But I think it does look pretty good, to be fair. From this angle, there's a bit of red, Ineos red, Petronas blue, whatever they say. But better rear axle, that's the main point. Changing the rear suspension, more secure, more stable at the rear of the car, and better straight line speed. Both of those things have been addressed, it seems, by the way the car is tackled, basically at the rear of the car. They've changed the rear suspension. They've gone from the pull rod rear suspension to the push rod rear suspension. That's what Red Bull have pioneered. Now they are maintaining the push rod front suspension. Red Bull use pull rod front suspension, but they still believe they can gain the advantage there. The belief is that there is an aerodynamic advantage in this set of regulations to the push rod rear suspension. Every team but Ferrari, and therefore Haas, will have that this year. Ferrari believe it's actually not that big of a deal, and they think that they understand how to get the best out of what they've done with the pull rod rear suspension. Mercedes have changed their minds. They've gone for push rod now. On the fronts, the general belief of the engineers seems to be that you can use either pull rod or push rod, and it will probably work as long as you bake in enough anti-dive, which is, one of the key points on maintaining the aerodynamic platform in this set of regulations. So as James Allison says, improving the unpredictable rear axle of the car, and better straight line speed, better DRS performance. A lot of that comes down to the packaging of the car at the rear as well. The belief is that with the pushrod rear suspension, they can package the car more narrowly, they can therefore create less drag, have a smaller gearbox, and generate higher straight line speeds. So there's a few things they're focusing on. Toto Wolff said development has gone well relative to the ambitious objectives that they set themselves. Sometimes you come up just short, sometimes you do better than you thought, but it's many things that we put high on their priority list to make more drivable, be that ride or stability. We'll only know if we've achieved that once we get onto the track, and of course that's what Lewis Hamilton will try and figure out today and over, of course, when testing begins in Bahrain. So it's interesting that McLaren are saying, well, we've improved a lot, but we've got to do more. Mercedes are saying, well, we've tried to do everything and we believe we might have succeeded, but the time will only tell on that one. So Craig Scarborough and others were doing the analysis on this, but especially of the actual pictures of the car itself, because the renders are different to the real car. This is some analysis on the pushrod retained on the front suspension, the pushrod now on the rear suspension. The cockpit position, of course, changed as well, has moved further rearwards compared to last year's, which has been obviously a major point that Hamilton was moaning about, and probably for good reason, during the course of the season. This massive undercut right, also the side impact structure where it used to be has been deleted, and that was indicative of they had to put the side impact structure where it was because of the zero pod. Once they got rid of the zero pod, they were still saddled with the weaknesses of that, so they've got rid of that completely. Deep undercut, V-section nose, but it's the front wing again, which is gaining a lot of the attention today. And I've said it before, and I'll probably say it again. Of every team on the grid, Mercedes' front wing department, I'm guessing they have one, is probably the most innovative on the grid. They've tried many interesting things over the years here, and even in recent times as well, they've done similarly. You guys probably remember the connectors they had between the front wing elements that were shaped in such a way to try and gain aerodynamic performance advantage. Also, all the trickery they've done with the end plate, or kind of, basically the front wing end plate here, where they would leave a gap between the bottom of it to try and generate more vortices to create downforce. Now, the developers of the regulations, the FIA, have really tried over the last few years to push back against this type of innovation because the engineers always try and generate more downforce. The regulators say, well, we want to ensure that the downforce is generated in such a way that it doesn't create a massive wake that will affect the car behind. So they've really tried to limit the engineers what they can do, but engineers are engineers. They will try and find ways around some of these issues, and Mercedes have, on the front wing, been the best at doing that, I would say, over the last few years. And the front wing, arguably, the most important part of the car, because it determines how the airflow happens around the rest of the car. Notably, of course, on number one here, we do have, as expected on the other cars, the lower element is below the nose of the front wing. So basically, air can travel underneath the nose into the floor, which is what Red Bull pretty much pioneered as well over the last couple of years. And we've seen Ferrari and now Aston Martin and others basically all copy this concept. But where you want to be looking here is number 4 and number 3. So the regulations changed over the last couple of years so that the front wing elements have to connect onto the nose itself. That's the rule that is now in place. However, the engineers might find a way around this because there was something called the Y250 vortex, and I'll share some examples of it here in a second to help control the front tire wake. Now that was generated right out of these top elements of the front wing, but it only really works if they're not connected, at least visibly, to the nose itself. This is one of the things that the regulators were trying to prevent. However, we do know that the FIA have actually said that there's quite a few things on these cars over the last couple of years that are generating far more dirty air behind the car than was intended, and therefore that is a problem. You know, basically overtaking becomes harder, even though these regulations are meant to fix that. But the regulators have said, well, we're not really going to do anything about that until the new regulations in 2026. So the engineers at Mercedes might have think, you know what, they're probably not going to ban this. Let's just go for it and see what happens. So this is on a Ferrari of several years ago now. Have a look at this wake kit. You guys can see the vortex generated out of the front wing. And you can actually see this as well here in this screenshot from a couple of years ago with, on the front wing, this vortex being generated here. Now, as you can see, the front wings back then looked remarkably different, with a major gap here between the elements of the front wing and the nose of the car. This gap was allowed to be 250 millimeters, which is why this vortex is referred to as Y250. So organic measurement explains kind of the details here. This is another great image actually of it on a Red Bull car, of course, Max Verstappen's Red Bull from a couple of years ago, on the front wing generating this vortex Y250 and the outwash. These are two elements that the regulators have tried to shut down because they do affect the dirty air for the car behind. And as you can see, there's a pretty big gap here between the nose of the car and where those elements of the front wing begin. But despite the fact that the new rules require all front wing elements to directly join to the nose, that was to get rid of the Y250 and make the front wings less prone to braking as well, because they're more stable now. Mercedes have come up with another approach whereby this element of the front wing here, element 4, is connected by a small little wire. This is often the way that the engineers can get around things, is by disconnecting this top element from the wing, but using a small little wire to connect it. So they say, look guys, we're connected, it is connected to the nose, but they can use this discontinuity, as is nicely described, to create this vortex that they're looking for. So it wouldn't be anywhere near as powerful, obviously, as the vortex generated previously, when you can have, like, as we see here, like, all of the elements are separate, so you gain a lot more in terms of that, but Mercedes would be able to gain some degree of aerodynamic advantage from this change that we haven't seen on any other car. So there's two things to say about this, really. Why have Mercedes revealed this now, on the day that they reveal their car? They could have just shown this in Bahrain when they turn up for the first time. They didn't have to show it on their reveal day, because obviously we're talking about it. I'm sure that the engineers around the grid are talking about it. I'm sure that there's discussions with the FIA they might have to have about it, right? Because is this change in the spirit of the regulations? It might well be legal. And if it is considered legal, then other teams will probably be, not exactly scrambling, but they'll probably think, well, damn, Mercedes have done this. We've got to do this at some point. Time to start working on our next generation front wing. Or the teams will say, look, FIA, this isn't meant to be allowed. It's not in the spirit of the rules, and therefore this should be banned. Mercedes should have to make an alternative or whatever. But I don't know if that's going to happen. So it's going to be fascinating to see either way. Definitely some big innovations on this Mercedes car. There's no doubt about it. But we'll see in Bahrain exactly what that is and whether this front wing design, which seems to be unique to the Mercedes so far, I guess we'll see about the Red Bull when they reveal their car tomorrow, is actually going to be deemed legal or not over the coming weeks. So very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Just one final thing to mention. Christian Horner allegations, the drama that continues. The belief is that he is going to be there at the launch tomorrow, which will be quite fascinating to see how that all goes. But there's been rumours over the last few days that Bernie was not just advising Horner to, on the situation, but actually advising him to resign. So Bernie actually said today on his social media, to clarify reports by newspapers that I had urged or suggested that Horner should resign, they are entirely untrue. So doesn't deny that he's been in conversations with Horner and discussing things with Horner, but he does say that I have not asked him to step down or to resign. So, look, the story on this is definitely not going to go anytime soon, but very much intrigued to your thoughts on all this stuff in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. Nearly at 37,000 subs as well, I believe. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you next time.